Hey, welcome back. Welcome to another Tales from the Workshop from Mr. Jones Watches, which is where we look behind the scenes at what we get up to here. This week we've got a new release which is called Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye, designed by Paul Wardski, and we're going to have a little look through the samples and also at the watch itself. So Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye is a sun and moon type watch, and on a sun and moon watch you read the hours from the position of the sun or the moon in the crescent shape at the top of the dial. The minutes work in the sort of normal way in that one complete revolution of the dial is 1 hour. So the birds indicate the minutes, and in this case the moon indicates the hour. The crescent shape shows you 12 hours running from 6 until 6. If the moon's up, that's the hours from 6 p.m. through to 6 a.m. So as it is at the moment, the minutes are on 0 and the moon is on 12, which is the very top of the crescent. So this is showing midnight. So if I keep winding it through, that would be 1 a.m, 1:30, 1:45, 2, through. If I keep winding it through at 6 a.m, the moon sets, and at that point the sun rises on the opposite side. So that would be 6 a.m, 7, 8, 9. If I wind it through to the top, like the sun at the apex of the crescent is midday. It lends itself very well to sort of pictorial designs, and it's also nice because it has a kind of context for the hours, even though we know the sun doesn't set exactly at 6 p.m. every day and rise at 6 a.m, but it's a kind of way of understanding time that's a bit more linked to something tangible. The design has this sort of landscape that is based on a real landscape in the Isle of Skye that Paul visited, but you can see there's a real sort of unnatural quality to it, both in the colours of the landscape, but also in the sort of asymmetry between the size of the sun and the moon. So the moon is obviously disproportionately large compared to the sun, but it really has such a strong kind of graphical quality. And we've gilded both the sun and the moon in this case to give them that real, like, nice quality that you get from the gildings. The minutes are indicated by the 3 eagles. We thought it's just a really nice way of showing the minutes that retains this sort of pictorial style of the design, and you also get these really nice moments where they're sort of silhouetted against the moon, and silhouetted against the landscape. So that's the final production version of Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye, but let's look back through the samples to see how we got to that stage. So this is very first round sampling that we did, and you can see immediately like a number of things. Firstly, the landscape looks much more washed out. It's much less clearly defined than on the final production one. Also at this stage, the moon is printed rather than gilded, and the time-telling element is this sort of flock of birds. I think on this sample, the disc for the birds has been mounted back to front, which is why the birds kind of appear to be flying backwards. I don't think that was Paul's intention. That was more an error in the assembly. But right from the start, it's got some elements that are already there, like that real huge asymmetry between the 2 celestial bodies. In fact, in this first round sample, the sun is even smaller and the moon is even bigger, to really exaggerate that effect. There's also another minor error in the assembly of this, in that the glass was assembled upside down, so the hour markers are not present all the way around at the top, making it somewhat difficult to read the time. But this was the first sample, and I guess we really liked right from the start that really dramatic element of the moon, and having it so much larger than the sun. It feels really interesting and kind of intriguing, and as I mentioned on the actual production one, you get those really nice moments where the birds are kind of silhouetted against the moon. It's a really evocative kind of poetic kind of image that it creates. Okay, so second round sample, you'll see immediately the landscape looks much more like it does in the final one. This is an example of really the difference that the print technicians make to the process. So Kaylee, who was the main print technician working on certainly the sampling of Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye, Kaylee worked really hard to get the landscape looking much more dynamic and kind of interesting than on the first one. I think we went back to Paul and got some revised artwork for one thing, but she also worked hard to add in sort of different colour elements and increase the sort of contrast to really make much more distinction on the landscape. There are some elements that are still the same, so the moon and the birds at this stage are as they were on the first sample. The birds are actually flying in the right direction this time because the disc has been riveted the correct way around and the glass has been fitted the correct way around, so the hour markers are at the top, although it's slightly rotated relative to the dial, which is why the radial lines on the dial don't quite line up with the markers on the glass. Reviewing this sample, we sort of felt that there wasn't enough distinction between the skyscape and the landscape, because they're all that sort of bluey, greeny colour. We took inspiration from one of the prints that we have in the workshop that Paul made that has this very vibrant orange sky coupled with a more kind of subdued colour palette on the landscape. So this is the third round sample. So on this we've got this bright orange sky, which really makes it a much more dynamic image. It's much more distinction between the landscape and the skyscape. On this version, at this stage, we've introduced gilding for the first time. I think we were also playing around with the scale of the moon and the sun still at this point. So the moon is even larger than it was on the second round sample, although I think it's basically the same as the first round sample, like we reverted to that sort of scale. There were issues we felt with this round sample. So for one thing, the birds in the bottom half, when they're over the landscape, become quite difficult to pick out because they are just silhouettes. It's easy to lose them amongst the mountains and the sort of dark landscape kind of graphic. We also felt that maybe there wasn't quite enough, maybe the sky could have been more dynamic. I'll show you some examples. We toyed around with different airbrushings on the dial. So this is the dial as it's mounted into that sample that we just saw, but then this is more like what the production dial ended up with, which is a kind of ombre effect to the edges of the dial to give that kind of yellow to orange transition, which just makes for a bit more of a dynamic. Like if we look at that final production version, you get that more interesting kind of range of colours. It's nice to see the dials actually, and just to remind everyone that each of these dials is hand airbrushed, and Tanith and Lou, who do almost all of the airbrushing on the dials, are very skilled at repeating the same sort of effect across a batch of dials, which genuinely is a very difficult skill to learn. It's very hard to be consistent with something like that when you're spraying them to get them all looking exactly the same. So yeah, that was third round sample. I guess the main change we made between this and production was really changing the birds for the eagles, but we also enlarged the sun. We felt like at certain points, like around here, the sun became almost disappears behind that sort of rocky crag. So for final production version, there's not quite the same asymmetry between the sun and the moon as there was on some of those earlier versions. Like the sun is quite a bit larger, but we felt that was a reasonable change to make in order to increase the sort of legibility and stuff. And you can see on this The eagles are much easier to pick out when they're over the landscape because they're not the kind of monochrome silhouettes. They don't make quite as nice an image when they're passing in front of the sun and moon as the monochrome black ones did. But again, I feel like that's a reasonable compromise to keep the legibility when they're over the landscape. So I mentioned that Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye was designed by Paul Wardski. Paul Wardski was a member of the team here at Mr. Jones Watches for many years. He joined us back in 2016, coming from a fine art printmaking background, and he was one of the people who was really instrumental in taking our printing up a notch, and he introduced a lot of the processes and techniques that we use to this day. He was really one of the foundational people in taking our printing up to the level that we've got to now. Paul did quite a number of designs for us over the years, starting in 2017 with Wanderlust, which has, I guess, quite a strong sort of thematic link to Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye. It was also a sun and moon watch and also featured that kind of landscape as the sort of main motif on the dial. In 2018, there was a design called Vertigo. 2021, Far Out. I feel that Silver Moon over Cuillin Skye is probably the strongest expression of Paul's artistic practice that we've managed to create in the watch form. And I also really like that you can see elements of each of the different designs that he's done for us encapsulated into this one watch. The other main thing we've been working on in the workshop this week is the assembly of the special edition of Number Cruncher for the Windup Watch Fair in Chiraahgo. So this features the Number Cruncher Monster with a special dial that has 2 landmarks from Chiraahgo on it, and this is an edition of just 50 pieces. So Chiraahgo will only be available to people who come to visit us at the Windup Watch Fair in Chiraahgo, which takes place from July the 11th through to July the 13th. It's totally free to come and visit, and I know that there'll be a lot of interesting watch brands there, so a really worthwhile thing to come and see if you're in the Chiraahgo area. Okay, that's all for this week. I hope it was an interesting look through the sampling process of another design. I look forward to reading your comments and thoughts down below, and I'll see you next week.